Welcome to today's program titled Best Practices and Key Considerations for Employers Implementing Employee Resource Groups, ERGs. At this time, all participants are in a listen-only mode. For those of you who are logged into the web presentation, you are encouraged to submit questions throughout the conference by typing them into the Q&A box on the right-hand side of your screen, and we will follow up with you after the program. For those interested in obtaining CLE credit for this webinar, later in the presentation, we will read the CLE attendance verification code. Please write this code down, as it will not be reread and it is required on the CLE credit request form. During the program, you will see a slide with a QR code that you may scan to access and submit your request for CLE credit. You can also find a link to the form in the connection details email you received this morning. Copies of the webinar recording and materials will be distributed to all attendees in the days following the webinar. On the next slide, you will see a legal disclaimer. This presentation has been prepared by Seyfarth Shaw LLP for informational purposes only. The material discussed during this webinar should not be construed as legal advice or a legal opinion on any specific facts or circumstances. The content is intended for general information purposes only, and you are urged to consult a lawyer concerning your own situation and any specific legal questions you may have. At this time, I would like to turn it over to our first speaker for today's program, Laura Mecklin. Laura, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Kate, and welcome to everyone. We're so pleased to have you with us for the 7th installation of our DEI micro webinar series. This is a series that is intended to cover specific topics in a short webinar. And obviously we have a lot to cover today, so we'll jump right in just as soon as we do introductions. Please do share questions and answers. There are a variety of topics that could take a whole webinar or micro webinar into themselves. So we're going to try to cover a lot of the highlights and basics for how to manage ERGs, and then actually we'll share with you an upcoming presentation on additional ERG topics after today. So I did want to introduce myself. My name is Laura Mecklin. Some of you may know me from other different roles I may play with the firm, but in my legal practice, I'm proud to be a member of our People Analytics group and our DE&I consulting group. I sit in San Francisco and a member of the Labor and Employment Department. Sade, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Sade Scahan, and I am a partner in our Century City, Los Angeles office. I, too, sit in our People Analytics group as well as single plaintiff employment litigation. So I enjoy advising on all types of issues, such as the ones that we're discussing today.
Excellent. So on the next slide, you'll see our agenda for today. We're going to cover 4 basic buckets of information. First, Sade is going to talk a bit about what are we talking about when we say ERG. There is other terminology to use when thinking about groups like these, and she'll go over the basics with that. We're then going to get into the legal framework, where Sade and I will both talk about some of the key legal risks and or considerations that employers should have when they are implementing and managing these groups. Sade is going to talk about aligning ERG objectives with company goals, and then I'm going to talk a bit about best practices when implementing and actually managing these groups. So next slide. Sade.
All right, so getting into the initial definition section, what is an ERG? If we can switch to the next slide, these are some of the terms that you probably recognize: BRG versus ERG versus affinity group. They all have similar meanings, and a lot of times people use them interchangeably, but they all are actually a little bit different. For example, an affinity group is really intended to be just a group of employees that have shared interests or shared affinities, kind of a common bond that they can all get together for camaraderie. Whereas the business resource group, the BRG or the ERG, those are more intended to align with the actual goals of the company. So it's not just intended to be a way for employees to share a common interest, but also a way to integrate that into what the organization's business plan is. So sometimes these terms are used interchangeably, but it's really actually helpful to look at the purpose of the group itself to figure out the correct terminology. all BRGs and ERGs essentially are affinity groups, but not all affinity groups are going to be ERGs because they don't necessarily have that alignment with business goals. So for today, we are going to use the term ERGs, and on the next slide, we will discuss a little bit of background on what employee resource groups are, what are we talking about exactly when we are looking at ERGs, and whether it makes sense for your business to create one. So these should all be voluntary and employee-led groups. These aren't something that's going to have a manager that's leading a group of employees on discussion topics or anything like this. It's all voluntary to join, and it shouldn't be exclusive. So an employee or individual should not have to be a member of whatever the particular affinity is in order to actually be a member of the group. So anyone can join any ERG that they're interested in joining. And overall, we want to make sure that they're promoting inclusivity. And again, they're inclusive of all different employees, allies, and members of the particular group. It should be connecting the employees who are sharing particular interests or particular identities. And oftentimes an ERG is going to focus on some type of common identity. A lot of businesses have race-based ERGs and gender-based ERGs, as well as sexual orientation. These are kind of the most popular topics, but there are other topics that can be used to form an ERG as well, and we'll kind of hit on a couple later on as well. But there are a lot of benefits for both the employees and for the businesses themselves in creating ERGs, and that's part of the reason that we see a lot of interest in creating them, but also a lot of questions around what type of parameters we're going to use for them. But having ERGs has oftentimes been a good kind of marketing point for businesses to help attract, recruit, and actually retain employees as well. If employees feel like they are part of an inclusive work environment and they kind of have a place, that is going to build their satisfaction with the job and potentially be something that helps with the retention of employees. And retention of employees is good because it costs a lot of money to have to hire new employees and to have to train new employees. So we want to make sure that we are creating a space that everyone feels is inclusive and also is at the same time supporting the company's goals. It's also going to create diversity and cultural awareness within the workplace as well, and increases the satisfaction and morale of your employees. The ERGs also can be beneficial because a lot of times they will help foster some type of professional development and learning opportunities for the employees who are members of this ERG, whether it's through mentoring, if it's internal or external networking, and just opening general dialogues and exchanging of ideas, which is part of the benefit of having a diverse workforce in the first place. A lot of people, when they think of ERGs, and they think just of affinity groups, which are kind of more of a support group, ERGs are, in a sense, a support group, but we want to make sure that it's clear that these are also really going to be tied to business goals and the goals in general for the company when you're creating an ERG, as opposed to just creating an affinity group. So on the next slides, we will get into the legal framework of ERGs, kind of what should be considered when deciding whether you're going to create one, and also just what are the parameters if creating an ERG. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on a number of protected classifications, as many of you are aware. Employers cannot apply policies inconsistently to anyone of any certain particular protected classification. So you want to be careful when you are creating an ERG and also maintaining and running them that they're not operating in any sort of discriminatory framework that would open the company up for risk, because of course the part of the ERG is supposed to be a benefit to both the business and to the employees. So we don't want to create an ERG without being thoughtful about it, because that could create risk for the business and then have the opposite purpose. There is a somewhat old case from 2005 that concerns employee resource groups, and that case, called Moransky versus GM, it was essentially addressing an individual who wanted to create a religious employee resource group, and the employer declined to create a religion group. There was a rule saying that there were going to be no ERGs that promoted or advocated any particular religious position. And in that case, the court held that the employer's refusal to grant that particular affinity group status did not constitute religious discrimination because it was treating all religious groups equally. So it wasn't just Christians that weren't allowed to, it was a complete prohibition on any ERGs with any religious positions. So companies can have policies to refuse to recognize an ERG that's supporting a religious position or belief, but there can't be a policy of refusing to recognize an ERG that seeks to promote one particular belief versus other religious beliefs. So for many years, a lot of businesses have excluded belief-based groups like political beliefs, for example, and faith-based ERGs, but there's a lot of considerations that come into play when determining whether that's also going to be the policy of your business as well. And we, especially in the recent years, have gotten a lot of questions about faith-based ERGs in particular. So we actually are going to have a separate micro webinar in the series that's solely focused on faith-based and religious ERGs and the considerations when determining whether that's something to pursue for your particular business. Laura is going to touch on this a little bit more, but we also wanted to note that on the next slide, there are other considerations as well about EEO considerations and how you're treating the ERGs. But really the main point of all of this is that you want to treat everyone the same. You want to treat all members of ERGs the same. If there are employees who are not members of ERGs, they should be treated equally to the members of ERGs. So there should be no beneficial treatment one way or another, and also no discriminatory treatment one way or another just based upon someone's participation in an ERG. ERGs, again, are supposed to be a safe space for employees and also have a business goal and promote your business's goals. So we want to make sure that everyone's being treated equally so you're not opening yourself up to potential legal issues. And Laura now will touch on a few other legal issues to be mindful of.
Yeah, so the next section just talks a little bit about legal compliance issues related to individual concerns of discrimination. So employers really should consider how they work with ERGs or the work within ERGs may cause individual concerns to be raised. And if they are EEO related, how those should be handled. We often see several scenarios. So one is when employees individually share about their work experiences that may raise EEO concerns in the workplace. A few points with that, ERGs should not really be the forum to address individual complaints of discrimination. Obviously, regular company channels should be utilized for that. Occasionally, we've seen some issues where an ERG leader says, oh, but I should be the person to address this because I might be in a good position to do so, or I really understand the issues of the ERG. And you want to just make sure that those issues are carefully handled and that the EEO complaint is sent to the right place, not within the ERG. We'll talk about some best practices here in the next section about how actually to do that. In addition, oftentimes managers can be in these meetings. They may be members of the ERG or senior advisors or something like that, where a complaint is raised. And obviously, if a complaint is raised within earshot of management and not addressed, in some circumstances, obviously, the law may impute knowledge of complaints to management, and management may be under an obligation to respond to those complaints. A second scenario that we see a lot is that in the interest of encouraging open communications among ERG members about information and ideas, ERG leadership or others may be tempted to have ground rules for meetings, calling for confidentiality, saying what stays here, what's shared here rather stays here. And obviously that can create some issues depending on the scenario. One, It could hinder employee rights to discuss the terms and conditions of their employment. We have concerns around that in terms of Section 7 rights under the National Labor Relations Act, of course. We also want to make sure that we don't deter employees from actively using company mechanisms in place for raising concerns like hotlines or other avenues for that. So you want to make sure that you're avoiding any kind of business practice or policies as part of these groups that would hinder the expeditious communication of complaints. The next slide talks a little bit about labor issues, and we got some questions a minute ago about this topic when Sade kind of lightly touched on it. So everyone should just stay aware, and this is an issue that I think is somewhat less discussed or less known among some folks leading ERGs, but Section 8A2 of the NLRA makes it an unfair labor practice for an employer to, quote, dominate or interfere with the formation or administration of any labor organization or contribute financial or other support. So as we note here, the term labor organization is actually kind of broad. It's any organization of any kind or any agency or an employee representation committee or plan in which employees participate and which exists for the purpose, in whole or in part, of dealing with employers concerning grievances, labor disputes, wages, rates of pay, hours of employment, or conditions of work. You know, in turn, the term dealing with is important. That's basically a bilateral mechanism through which an employee, entity, and management reciprocally interact. So there needs to be that bilaterally dealing with if there is an a labor organization referred to. We don't see this arise a lot with respect to ERGs. It's important to note we don't see that a lot. However, we want to manage to this risk where there could be risk in terms of whether an ERG could be representational in character and could meet the definition of this. And so the main questions there under the Act are, you know, does the group have a representational character? Does it focus on grievances, wages, benefits, hours of work, or terms or conditions of employment? And does it deal with management on those topics? So we're always wanting to watch for that. There's not a bright line test, you know, but again, luckily our work in the ERG and DE&I space doesn't often see this risk, because we haven't seen a lot of cases on this. Usually arises in unionized operations or during an NLRB representation election campaign. In the absence of a threatened or ongoing organizing campaign, violations typically are simply to require that the group disband or stop dealing with the employer. So the remedies, you know, aren't very severe, but within a union context, they could have more severity. So we wanted to flag that as something that you want to be aware of and at least manage to through the work of the managing the group. So next slide. We also wanted to talk about wage and hour considerations, and just to flag here that you want to make sure that you're managing ERG participation carefully for non-exempt personnel, obviously defining work time under FLSA or state law as compared to totally voluntary or unrelated to work duty time that may not need to be compensated. There is a regulation under federal law talking about lectures, meetings, and training programs. So under the FLSA, attendance at lectures, meeting, and training programs and similar activities does not need to be compensated, provided 4 criteria are met. The attendance has to be outside the employee's regular working hours. Attendance has to be completely voluntary. The course, lecture, or meeting cannot be related in any way to the employee's job. And the employee does not perform any productive work during their attendance at the meeting. So you have to meet all of those 4 factors. And again, that's federal law. So there's a ton of state law overlay here that you need to watch for. And this is just one way in which there may be an argument that ERG work is not compensated. Of course, many employers set up their programs where the work is compensated and during work hours. Certainly if a meeting has to do with you know, various business related efforts, then arguing that it's totally unrelated to work duties may be difficult. Other wage and hour flags, one is reasonable business expenses. People often buy supplies and other, things needed for meetings, especially if they're occurring, at lunchtime hours, mealtime, or other ways. So you want to make sure to watch for that. And also, we'll talk in a minute here about there is an increasing expectation around compensation for the leadership roles for ERGs. So with that, let's get to the next slide.
So now we're going to cover a little bit more about how we're focusing on aligning the ERG objectives with the company's goals. On the next slide, we highlight that ERGs should first be in alignment with the company's DEI strategy, whatever that may be, and the ERG should align with the values, mission, and goals of the organization. They shouldn't be formed unless there's a clear and defined reason for their formation. So the first question is, should we even have an ERG, and what problem are we trying to solve by having them? What is the goal of creating an ERG? We don't want to do it because it's something that just sounds good, but we want an actual purpose behind why we opted to create these types of groups within the organization. Some companies have decided to forego ERGs entirely because it doesn't align with the company strategy, whereas others have really focused and honed in on having a very refined system for creating ERGs and submitting requests to create new ones. So it's really important to make sure that there's some kind of defined reason for why you're going to create an ERG, and to the extent you can have it relate back to something else more objective, like what trends are you seeing, what opportunities are there out there, and what company data do you have if there's an area that kind of seems to be needing to be addressed a little bit more, or a weakness that you think could be addressed by creating an ERG for the employees, then that's something that could be considered. On the next slide, we have just a few examples of how some of these goals could align with the creation of an ERG, and this list is by no means exhaustive. There's a lot of different reasons why an organization might decide that it's appropriate for them to create an ERG, but we wanted to provide just a few examples of things that might be considered as to why we want to create an ERG and what are the business's goals. And I think the first one is kind of the overarching big reason why a lot of organizations decide to proceed with an ERG, because they want to make sure that their employees feel like they're working in a welcoming and inclusive environment. And some of you may have heard now that some people don't refer to just the term DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, but some add the B at the end, DEIB, which is diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, because the belonging piece is what makes people want to stay with an organization. It's not just that they feel included, but also that they feel like they have a place at the company and that they actually belong there too. There's also a potential social impact. A lot of organizations like to engage in some community service activities, and also they have kind of an external view sometimes of the ERGs as well. A lot of organizations advertise on their websites that they have ERGs as part of their business strategy or DEI strategy. So there's public-facing reasons that you can have an ERG as well, and that looks good to customers, to clients, to employees, and to potential applicants who might want to join the organization. And again, there's a desire oftentimes to create a sense of belonging for people, especially if they're in an underrepresented group. But going back at the end here, we want to make sure everything is in alignment with the company's priorities, because first and foremost, it is a business, and these are your employees who are going to be spending time participating in these ERGs, so want to make sure that everything is in alignment. We're going to close up covering just a few best practices for ERGs, and I will cover just kind of a highlight of some of the best practices, but a lot of these we have reiterated throughout this presentation because we want to make sure that you have a clear mission for the ERGs. That's the most important, and that there's also some kind of procedure or policy that is created for how an ERG is going to be recognized and how it's going to continue to exist within the organization. We've seen some ineffective creation of ERGs, and sometimes they can end up causing problems if it hasn't really been fully thought through and fleshed out about how you want to maintain and create these ERGs. So there should be some kind of process in place that's a little bit more formal or clear, that people understand how they could submit a request to create a particular ERG, or how an ERG is going to continue to exist throughout the years and be evaluated as to whether this is something that should be maintained. Again, reiterating that it should be inclusive and it should be made very clear to all employees and to anyone else who is involved in approving these ERGs that it should be very inclusive of everyone. Anyone who wants to join the ERG, no matter what the topic is, that individual is allowed to participate. And then there should be some type of review every so often about what the ERG has been doing, how people have been feeling that it contributes positively or negatively to their experience at the company, and then if there's any budgetary concerns, because as Laura mentioned, sometimes people are buying certain things as part of their participation in the ERGs. So what type of budgets need to be allocated to the organization's ERGs? And if more and more are being created, that's something that's going to have to be considered, as well as what is going to be the cost of having these additional ERGs and making sure everyone is being treated as equally as possible. And then also there should be some kind of rules and guidelines about employees who are participating in the ERGs, and a reiteration that company policies apply when employees are participating in ERGs. Sometimes there's a little bit of a distraction that employees end up foregoing some of their actual work responsibilities because they get hyper-focused on this ERG that's really important and meaningful to them. And it's great that these ERGs are meaningful to the employees, but you also want to make sure that all employees know that they should be doing their job and their job comes first, and you shouldn't be participating in an ERG at the expense of you actually performing your work duties. Laura will highlight a little bit more about best practices for managing the labor risk that she had mentioned before.
Yeah, so on the next slide, you know, a lot of this can be dealt with in the guidelines that Sade was just talking about. We do suggest that there be ERG guidelines that are published at least to your ERG leaders, and that you consider also doing training against those guidelines so they understand what potential you know, risks can come up, or common issues or scenarios, and how they should be handled according to, you know, each company and the way in which you you know, manage with your talent and your workforce. On the managing the labor risk, you know, we have some suggestions here, and the PowerPoint will be shared with everyone. But, you know, certainly soliciting feedback from ERGs is an important thing, especially when you're trying to drive a culture of inclusion and belonging. So suggestion boxes, engagement surveys, brainstorming groups where ideas are generated are all fine. Where an ERG essentially negotiates with management is where, like I mentioned, we may have more concern, or maybe that might be discouraged. So we want to make sure that there's not the bilateral negotiation, but certainly lots of idea generation and brainstorming could be fine. You don't want to have a representational character to these groups either, in the sense that you elect leaders, and those leaders are meant to represent employees vis-a-vis management or the rest of the company. These really should take a tone and a flavor around creating inclusive spaces for everyone in the company to support certain groups, learn, grow, and support the overall business objectives of the company, of course. You want to make sure that where terms and conditions of employment are discussed, that they're routed to the right in the right direction, and that the mission and purpose of the ERG is very clear. And a lot of times those are ways that you can deal with that. Some employers actually do put a disclaimer in their guidelines talking about the limits of each group's purpose, and specifically saying that the purpose of the group is not to be a forum to address terms and conditions of employment. So that's another way to deal with this. On the next slide, we have a few other key topics and recommendations that we'll get to really fast. So one, be aware of how your ERG leaders may have access to and use EEO data. Of course, that data is confidential. We have discovered some situations where ERG leaders have used EEO data and done a whole lot of slicing and dicing of that data without involvement of legal. So just stay careful about how that's being done. I did reference leader compensation and job duties. We did get a question about that here. There has been a movement among DEI professionals to shed light on the fact that a lot of times these roles are meaningful. They take, skill set and a lot of energy and time by leaders, and should not be considered housework if it's a meaningful role within companies. So there had been a push among DEI leaders to try to get ERG leaders compensated for their work, and we've seen some companies adopt a small stipend for the work as well as a bonus structure if the work is significant enough. We do also recommend there be senior sponsors or an advisor to each group. That's important to make sure that somebody has oversight of the group, from management. That person usually is an advisor or simply a sponsor, not the actual leader of the group, to Chardae's point. And then we cover the issue about training. And we do recommend that there be some training for your leaders so they understand how you expect them to run the groups. And then finally, just manage carefully requests for exclusive meetings. A lot of times group members want safe space for their members, but we want to make sure that there isn't too much or there isn't exclusive meetings focused on people just of one EEO status or another. So we hope that this very quick tutorial helps. Please watch out for the next upcoming ERG micro webinar related to the faith-based and religious ERG subject, because we've had a lot of discussion and among clients and with other groups around that hot topic. And we're going to unpack the concept of faith-based ERGs in another session upcoming. Kate, over to you.
All right, at this time, we will read the CLE code for today's program. Please write this code down, and you may take a moment to scan the QR code on the screen to access the request form, or as a reminder, you can find the link to the form in the connection details email from this morning. The CLE code for this webinar is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 9714. Once again, the code is SS, as in Seyfarth Shaw, 9714. Thank you so much to our presenters. This concludes today's webinar, and thank you for attending.